Hi, biology concepts. In this set of notes, we will be learning about cell theory and the remarkable discovery of microscopic life. So your essential questions for today include essential question 1, what are cells? Essential question 2, what is cell theory? And your learning target for today is by the end of this set of notes, you should be able to state the 3 principles of cell theory. So what exactly is a cell? A cell is the most simple and smallest living organism. Cells are the building blocks of living things, and there is nothing smaller than a cell that is considered to be alive. If you take a look at this picture, here we see an example of a whole organism. Within a whole organism, you have organ systems, for example, your respiratory system, which includes multiple organs. Organs are made up of tissues, and tissues are basically many cells working together. And within that, you have individual cells. Now, we are an example of a multicellular organism, meaning we have many cells that work together to build us. But some organisms that we'll learn about are made of just one single cell. So with that in mind, there is nothing smaller than a cell that is considered to be alive. Cells provide structure for the body. They take in nutrients from food that we eat. They convert those nutrients into energy, and they carry out specialized functions. Cells also contain the body's hereditary material called DNA, and they can make copies of themselves. In this picture here, in this image, you can see that these are bacterial cells that are rapidly dividing. So one bacterial cell can make many bacterial cells. This video here is showing the structure of plant cells. So each of these rectangular boxes is one plant cell. And in this image, we see an example of a paramecium, which is a one-cellular or unicellular living animal. Many scientists spend their entire careers studying cells, and this is called cytology. In cytology, a scientist might specialize in learning about the function of a type of cell or some of the structures inside of that cell. They might look at different types of cells. They might study how cells divide, and they might study how all of those things affect the human body and cause disease. Some organisms are unicellular. The entire living organism is made of just one cell. There are many examples of unicellular organisms, including bacteria. Bacteria were actually the first cells to evolve on our planet. So is the current hypothesis. In this picture are some examples of many of the different types of bacteria. Some bacteria have spikes, some are circular in structure, and some are rod-shaped. Sometimes they even have little structures called flagella, or little hair-like structures called cilia, that help them move around in their environment. Another example of a unicellular organism are some types of plants, including some types of algae. Algae produce the oxygen that's necessary for more complex life to evolve. So our earliest planet was probably oceans filled with different types of bacteria or archaebacteria, which is another type of organism. And eventually we had our first plant cells evolve. And these algae helped produce the oxygen that we use today. So algae are an example of unicellular. Another example of unicellular organisms are protists, which are kind of considered to be little tiny animals. And in this video, you can see an example of what's called euglena. Euglena has one long whip-like tail called a flagella that helps it move around in its environment and capture things. And you can see they also use their little cell body to move around. In this image, you can see an example of an amoeba, A-M-O-E-B-A. This amoeba slowly moves and stretches its, you could call it a little body, but it's actually just one cell, remember that. So it stretches out its cellular parts to capture. Here's, for example, a paramecium that it has captured and is now going to consume. And I don't know what this is, to be frank, but it's another example of a protist, and you can see all the little structures inside of it doing different jobs. Organisms can also be multicellular. Multicellular organisms are ones that have 2 or more cells. Some examples include Volvox, which is a type of algae, and Volvox is similar to what the first multicellular organisms might have looked like, where each of these is a single cell and they work together within a larger structure. So you have multiple cells now kind of clumped doing a similar job. And so this is an example of a multicellular plant. And multicellular plants could also be very much bigger. For example, here we have a flower, which you might think of. And then animals include all of the diversity of animal life that we might think about when we think about animals. So think about what your favorite animal is. I have cats and dogs, so that's one example of a multicellular animal. And fungi are also examples of multicellular organisms. So who exactly discovered cells, and what technology did they use to discover cells, and what exactly is cell theory? So Robert Hooke was one of the first scientists to study and record cells by using a microscope. And in this picture here, you can see an example of an early microscope where it was curved lenses, similar to the lenses that they might have used in a telescope to see far away out into space. They use curved glass lenses to make really tiny things appear bigger when you look through the eyepiece. And he was the first person to use the word cell, because when he was looking at the plant cell, so he took samples of cork. Cork you might think of as being like that spongy material. It is actually dead plant cells. And so when he took tiny little thin layers of plant cork cells and looked at them under the microscope, he noticed these little boxy structures. And these boxy structures that Robert Hooke saw reminded him of the small rooms that monks lived in a monastery. And these rooms were called cells. And so that's why he coined the term cell, to refer to these tiny little structures that made up the whole cork tissue. So here's a cool little video I want you to watch. Please watch it all the way through to learn more about the first discovery of microscopic animal cells.
Everything that you can actually see with your eye is just the smallest sliver of life on this earth. Most of life is invisible. We still have this idea that we're the most central feature of Earth. And it's the humans that are the bystanders. The microbes are doing the work.
Wat doe je als je dingen ziet wat niemand ooit heeft gezien? What do you do when you see things that no one has ever seen before? L-A-Y, lay, u, then, they pronounce it with a V, Hoek, Leeuwenhoek.
Anthony van Leeuwenhoek. He was a haberdasher in the city of Delft in the Netherlands.
And why his curiosity found an outlet in microscopes that is just lost to history, we really don't know.
The quality of his microscope was superb. He made some 500 of these small instruments, and only a few of them he showed to visitors. He never told anyone how he made his lenses.
Robert Hooke in England, he wrote this wonderful book, Micrographia.
The first observations of the small world with lenses.
One of the first things that Leeuwenhoek did was look at things that Hooke had looked at. There was a stinger of a bee, leg, I believe, of a louse, singular of lice. But he saw some things that Hooke didn't see because his lenses were better. It was summertime, it was August. The days are so long that you get a lot of algae growth on water. He called it green clouds. Curious again, he had what he calls a glass vessel, a jar probably, and he filled it with the water. The next day, he put it under his lens, and what he saw was green streaks. Among this was all these little animals. And these things were a whole lot smaller, like 1,000 times smaller than anything he had ever seen before. And I think the line is, I confess I could not but wonder at it.
Leeuwenhoek called them in Dutch dierkens. And dierkens, that's a diminutive of the word deer,
Deer, D-I-E-R.
and which is the Dutch word for animal.
What Leeuwenhoek called them was little animals.
This was all so new. The word microorganism did not exist at the time. The word bacteria is from the 19th century.
And that strikes me as Adam in the Garden of Eden, who in Genesis named all the animals. It was just a brand new world. And he was the first person in it.
He wrote a letter to the Royal Society, one of the first organizations to practice experimental science.
And they're going, oh my heavens, what is this?
At first they didn't believe it.
Finally, the other members of the Royal Society were also able to see it. And the rest is history.
And so he discovered many things,
Sperm, red blood cells, protozoa, and bacteria.
which nobody had ever seen before.
He is the first person to see everything he looked at for 50 years.
Van Leeuwenhoek wanted to see these things. Well, he saw them. But now we get most of life is microbial. If you look at the tree of life, only this tiny little part is every single thing you've seen. Every higher organism is covered, inside and out with bacteria. And humans would not be alive if these little 24/7 partners weren't giving us all of these genes and proteins that our own genomes don't encode. And they have all kinds of fabulous behaviors. Vibrio harvii, it's a marine bacterium. It looks like a sausage, and it's very fast. Vibrio means vibrate. And what is amazing is that if one watches them go from a single cell to a number of cells, all of the bacteria in unison start glowing in the dark. By studying this bioluminescent organism, we discovered that bacteria can communicate using a molecular language. We used to think that social behaviors were the purview of higher organisms. What we now understand is that bacteria were probably the first organisms on this earth to ever communicate with one another. We're always looking at an unknown world. We're driven by our ignorance, and we're driven by the idea that the world must be more complex than what we understand right now. And that's enough inspiration to do an experiment. Can you imagine being the first one to see your sperm swimming around? I mean, that'd be a scary thing, right?
All right, so as scientists learn more and more about cells, their discoveries in a nutshell can be summarized as all plants are made of one or more cells. A scientist by the name of Matthias Schleiden, I don't know if it's pronounced Schleiden or Schleiden, he was studying plant cells, and he noticed that every plant that he looked at under a microscope had a similar structure. So each of these is a cell, and notice that all of these cells worked together. Now this is an image using a very advanced microscope that Matthias Schleiden would not have had access to in the 16 or 1700s, so keep that in mind. But this is a real advanced microscopic image of a cross-section of a plant. Another scientist by the name of Theodor Schwann was studying animals and animal tissues, and he noticed that all animals are also made of cells. So when he looked at cross-sections of animal tissue, he noticed there were lots of different cellular structures that worked together to create the whole organism. And lastly, there was another scientist by the name of Rudolf Virchow who was studying the process of cell division. And he observed that every cell that he observed had come from a previous cell. So here we originally see, here it is, one cell. You can see that this cell, I think this is a type of algae, is dividing to form two cells. So all of these discoveries eventually led to what we call the cell theory. So what exactly is cell theory? Cell theory states that all living things are composed of at least one or more cells, meaning nothing smaller than a single cell is considered to be alive. 2, cells are the basic unit of structure and function of all living things, meaning all of these cells work together to build the organism and help the organism function. And last but not least, number 3, new cells come from pre-existing cells. Through that process of cell division, we start with one original cell that divides into many. So the big question you might wonder about, well, what happened with the first cell? How did the first cell come to exist? We will hopefully answer that question later on in this school year, once we've built more basic background knowledge. All right, so this concludes the set of notes on Learning Target 1, what is cell theory? Following this, you'll be doing some practice questions and another video. Have a great day.